Okay, thank you everybody for joining today. We're really excited about this webinar entitled Measuring Effectiveness with MITRE ATT&CK. My name is Stephen Marshowitz, Director of Program Development here at TrustedSec. And if you haven't kept up with MITRE ATT&CK lately, it's gotten really complex. So today we're going to talk about where things are and how well you can achieve the results you're looking for with the ATT&CK framework. First, a few housekeeping items. The webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to go back and review it on our YouTube page or go to the links on the main page under events. We have them in both places to make it easier for you. We encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A area along the way as they come up. We'll make sure we get to them at the end of the presentation. So this is where I'd usually tell you a little bit about TrustedSec, but our speaker today has taken care of that and is going to hit on the security program focus areas that TrustedSec helps organizations with. Now, many of you already know Rocky. He's a huge friend of the show, appearing 1 to 2 times a year for us, internationally renowned and an overall great guy. He's been neck deep in this MITRE stuff for quite a while now. So Rocky, thanks for coming today and kick us off.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. So just background on me. I've been in InfoSec for it's been now 30 years. And my kind of role within TrustedSec is really helping organizations better align the protection of business critical data with actual business need and requirements. And at the end of the day, when we look at it from a very, very high level, we really are looking at it from these 3 primary areas, right? Program maturity, organizational effectiveness, and business risk. So, from a maturity perspective, measuring and seeing where the improvement points and priorities need to be. Effectiveness is really assessing and analyzing capabilities and controls. And then the risk is really, again, more aligned with, the business side of the house, looking at likelihood of nasty things happening to critical systems. And if they were to happen, what would be the financial ramifications to the organization? When we then really kind of take a step back and say, okay, why are we doing this? It really kind of boils down to these primary things, right? Prioritizing anything from requirements and next steps and roadmaps and things of that nature, being able to effectively communicate business needs to the technical teams. Kind of the reverse of that is risk communication, effectively communicating leadership's risk tolerances back to the technical team, so the technical teams know where to actually focus. And then at the end of all of this is really enabling decision-making and effectively communicating technical priorities in a meaningful way to leadership to help them make the right business decisions. So the first thing that I really want to touch upon, and this particular webinar is very much focused in on measuring organizational effectiveness. And TrustedSec, as Steve alluded to, I've been working, kind of neck deep in the MITRE framework for a long time. So we rely very heavily on the MITRE ATT&CK framework when we are looking at organizational effectiveness. So I'm going to kind of I'm going to step before we actually dive into how TrustedSec is looking at effectiveness and just kind of give a quick ATT&CK update. There have been a number of versions. We are currently on version 12, which was actually just released publicly a few weeks back in late October. So the majority of this is going to be looking at version 12, but I did just want to kind of represent that, so there were some earlier versions here as well. Many changes along the way between version 9 and version 10. There was an entire data source, kind of reorganization. And so, there, as MITRE kind of matures this framework, I expect that there will be, changes, here and there, year by year, et cetera. But where we're at today with version 12, the ATT&CK framework is broken down into these essentially components, right? Tactics, techniques, sub-techniques of techniques, data sources, data components, groups, which are actual threat groups, documented threat groups that are out there in the wild. Software, things like Mimikatz and Cobalt Strike, and mitigations, which we're gonna touch upon pretty, there's some really, really valuable stuff that can come out of the mitigations aspect of it. Version 12 also has a new thing that MITRE is tracking called campaigns. So I'm going to get into the details of each of those. For example, tactics, right? At a high level, these are the 14 tactics that comprise all of kind of all of the actual attack techniques fall underneath, right? So the example here I have highlighted is persistence, maintaining a foothold and whatnot. When we kind of begin diving into, let's say, persistence, then there's a number of actual techniques that live under the persistence tactic. So the example here that I've illustrated is modify authentication process. Adversaries may modify authentication mechanisms and processes to access user credentials, et cetera, et cetera. Now, not all techniques have sub-techniques, but many do. And so for this example, a sub-technique of modify authentication process is pluggable authentication modules, right? So the PAM, things that are related to PAM, accessing user credentials or enabling, otherwise unwarranted access to accounts. So that's kind of the tactic, technique, sub-technique relationship. And I illustrated earlier, there are close to 700, if not more, actual individual techniques and sub-techniques that really kind of fall underneath the 14 tactics. So next we have data sources. So data sources at a very, very high level really kind of illustrate, here's what you need to have visibility into in order to detect certain attack techniques, right? So, the generic definition here on the attack wiki, data sources represent the various subjects, topics of information that can be collected by sensors and logs. It can also include data components, which we'll dive into next, which identify specific properties and values of data source relevant to detecting, again, any given specific attack technique or sub-technique. So an example here, file at a high level is a data source, computer resource object managed by IO, storing data such as images and things of that nature. So on its own, there's not a whole lot that I think, really we can do that. When we get into the kind of like the next layer, which is data components, this is really where we can begin tying things back to techniques and or sub-techniques. So a data component of the data source file is file modification. Changes made to a file or its access permissions and attributes, typically to alter the contents of the targeted file. And you can see here that there are several actual techniques here that can be detected. This is just a very small sample set, but in this example, modify authentication process, which we've already talked about just as an example technique, and then the sub-technique pluggable authentication modules, those can be detected if tools in your environment have visibility into the data source file and the data component file modification. When we actually dive into, and I'm going to use the PAM example again, when we dive into that particular sub-technique, you'll also see that there are detections. Now, detections, this is essentially a list of the collective data sources and data components that can detect this particular sub-technique, right? So there's going to be at least one data source and data component kind of pairing that will be able to detect a particular technique, but it's typically one or more, right? And as you'll see, as we kind of progress into mapping out the tools in your environment to data sources that can detect different attack techniques or sub-techniques, you'll kind of get the feel for, oh well, maybe we don't have visibility into these data sources over here that could potentially detect a PAM violation or PAM, kind of attack. However, we have tools over here that have visibility into other data sources and data components that can actually detect those things. So part of the challenge is really kind of understanding, which of your tools in your environment have visibility into, specific data sources and data component pairs. Now, I'm going to kind of lay out what the coverage mapping looks like, right? So we've talked about the tactics, right? And then below them, our techniques, 193 parent techniques, either parent or standalone, and then 401 sub-techniques in the framework today as of version 12. And then detections, right? So detections, and then detecting a technique that is part of a specific tactic. And how can we actually do those detections? Through our data sources. Each detection is mapped to data sources, one or more, data source and data component pairing. And all of that then sources back to the tools in your environment, right? So this is going to be our process. I'm going to get into it in a little bit more detail, but I'm first going to finish up kind of the summary, kind of attack update. Attack is also, as I mentioned earlier, tracking a number of different threat groups. So there's an entire section in the attack.mitre.org wiki on these groups. I just picked Carbonac as an example. They happen to target financial institutions. They go back to 2013, and you can see here that Carbonac also has been known to use Mimikatz as an example, right? I'm certain there are certainly other software packages, that Carbonac has been seen to use in a while, but I'm going to pick on Mimikatz because I love it. So we have this kind of tying in, software in use by these particular groups. And if you dive then into Mimikatz, you see that Mimikatz actually, one of the attack techniques that it uses is OS credential dumping as the actual parent technique, and then LSAS memory as the sub technique. This really then gets us kind of, back to completing the circle, right? Because if we now know that Mimikatz, the software being used by Carbonac, uses from a technique perspective, OS credential dumping and LSAS memory, well, then we have the ability to then say, oh, well, how can I detect LSAS memory, OS credential dumping? And the detection there, or at least one of the detections for this particular attack technique, is command execution, right? So again, as we'll see, one of the keys here is actually mapping your tools to each of these individual data sources that your tools have visibility into. One of the also, in addition to detections, and this is relatively newer, probably version 10, version 11, but each of the attack techniques also now come with mitigations. So think of mitigations as kind of like, more of your higher level program maturity type, action that, that should be able to limit the actual success of any particular attack technique. So in this instance, OS credential dumping, LSAS memory, one of the mitigations is privileged process integrity. So if we take a look at privileged process integrity, you're going to notice a couple of really interesting things now. In this kind of like find the last column, they're calling it use, right? So I'm going to highlight that here. So these uses for each of these individual kind of individual higher level mitigations, privileged process integrity, as a high level kind of mitigation, you really do kind of need to get into some of the weeds, because privileged process integrity is going to be different from, let's say, operating system to operating system, right? So you're going to need to kind of have a number of these different types of uses. And when we really kind of start taking a look at these uses, one of the things that I've noticed is that they are very much kind of organized all across different levels of just in terms of detail, right? So you can see here, I've illustrated that, additional cloud roles is an actual mitigation. And the use there is ensure that all accounts use the least privilege they require. Well, that's very, very high level, right? I would almost attribute that to, at the level of a standard or a process. The next one, input capture, web portal capture. You can see that this one's a little bit more specific. Do not allow administrator accounts that have permissions to modify web content, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a little more detailed there. I would almost call that, at the level of, let's say, a procedure. The last one with interprocess communication, the uses, the mitigation use for that one, that's pretty specific. We're actually looking at Windows registry keys. Windows registry keys don't typically make it into, let's say, that level of detail typically doesn't make it into, let's say, a NIST CSF audit or assessment. So I would call that, more at the level of recommendation or instruction. Now, one of the really interesting things about now that these uses are in, and this is one of the things that I believe version 12, prior to version 12, these uses actually weren't in the STIX database that is freely available for anybody to download from the MITRE ATT&CK website, but now they are. So all of these, if you just, and I'll actually run through some of the tools that we use in terms of gathering a lot of the data out of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. But now all of these uses are in here. And one of the interesting things that kind of rang our bell is that now we actually have an interesting way to map MITRE itself, right? MITRE ATT&CK into a lot of the other frameworks, whether that's a CIS controls, framework, or the CSF program maturity framework, any of the ISOs, and even our TrustedSec OPSEC performance maturity framework. So this is actually on our side, on TrustedSec side, this is actually a work in progress where we're beginning to map everything, all of these different mitigation uses over to a lot of these different frameworks. And that's been very, very eye-opening, I guess, to say the least. I think the last one that I want to talk about here is campaigns. Campaigns are very new to ATT&CK version 12. And so there are only 14 campaigns so far. But you can see that, this example, Operation Wokow, is a cyber espionage campaign that targeted organizations around the world, including Brazil, China, France, et cetera, et cetera. So if you actually begin diving into these operations, you'll also kind of, it works the same way, right? You can kind of backtrack into, okay, well, this campaign, these groups were a part of that campaign, and these groups use these techniques, and these, this software, and these techniques used by this software are detectable by, the different differing data source and data component pairings. So when you really kind of step back and look at how everything is interrelated, I think MITRE has done a really, really great job. Especially now version 12 and the addition of the campaigns of really tying all of this stuff together. Okay, so that's kind of the ATT&CK version 12 update. I want to talk now about effectiveness, right? Effectiveness, organizational effectiveness. If we really just kind of take a look at it from a definitions perspective, to be effective means that we are achieving a desired outcome. And then effectiveness itself is really measuring the capabilities of achieving that desired outcome, right? So how capable are we? And from a measurement perspective, in terms of achieving our actual desired outcome, that's our effectiveness. What's our desired outcome? Well, the tools in our environment prevent attack techniques that lead to breaches. So, kind of getting the definitional aspect of all this out of the way, I want to kind of define now what our TrustedSec attack path effectiveness assessment actually is. So this is our organizational effectiveness measurement solution. And many organizations, probably most organizations, obviously purchase and invest in tools and other things to reduce the likelihood of attacks, right? However, simply owning a tool doesn't mean that you will actually detect and or prevent any of those attacks, right? It's just not how things work in the real world. So we need a means of actually measuring how effective organizations are based on the tools in their inventory of detecting and potentially preventing attacks that are, and we'll get to this in a little later, but attacks that may even be more relevant to their industry. And we can kind of sift a lot of other threat intelligence to kind of get to that point as well. And so here's kind of the methodology. So starting with the tools inventory and working with an organization and the teams to understand all the tools that are in the environment that potentially can contribute to the detection of attack techniques, right? That leads us then to coverage mapping, right? So now we have the tools. Now we have to take each tool and determine what data sources and data component pairings those tools actually have visibility into. This can also help us kind of also discover redundancies. You may have several tools that have visibility into the same data source and data component pairings. That may, but not always, that may illustrate redundancies that can ultimately potentially lead to cost savings, right? Maybe we don't need that tool because other tools in our environment have visibility into the same data sources and data components. So coverage mapping is then that next step. This really then gives us what I term a binary best case scenario. Based on the tools in your environment and the data sources that they have visibility into, you should, on paper, best case scenario, be able to detect all of these attack techniques by just kind of moving back up the chain from data sources and the techniques that they have the ability to detect. But that, again, is only best case scenario. So the next phase of this assessment is the effectiveness itself, rating the effectiveness. So working with the organization's teams to understand how effective their tools are in their environment. There's a lot that goes into that, that statement there, and I'm going to start diving into it. But first, I want to kind of show what all of this really kind of looks like. So this is just a representation of a number of 6 tools that are in an environment. So we're just going to start there, and if following along with the previous slides kind of methodology, once we have that inventory, now we need to map each tool to data sources that it has visibility into. So for example, Palo Alto firewalls likely have visibility into Active Directory credential requests, but probably not anything else. However, the Palo Alto firewalls are also going to have visibility into all of the firewall data sources and the sub data component pairings. So that's kind of, this is just a small snapshot. I believe there are 39 high-level data sources, and then we get into the data components that kind of fall underneath those things. So we've got our inventory, and now go through the process of actually mapping which data sources and data component pairings each tool has visibility into. And that gives us some interesting kind of heat maps from a coverage perspective. Now you can see in this particular kind of slide and window here, we're looking at coverage for the Windows platform, and we're actually looking at both protective and detective tools, because one of the things that we found has a lot of value is kind of being able to separate protective tools from detective tools to see, okay, well, the protective tools are really good at this stuff, but the detective tools are way better at doing some of this other stuff. And so that's really, really great to have kind of like that granularity. But in this instance, I'm looking at both. You can see that the little tab there in blue says both. So we're looking at both protective and detective tools there that have been defined already, but during that kind of tooling inventory. Now we can, and so this is the high level. Here's our 12 out of the 14 tactics that actually are detectable. 12 of them are detectable. 2 of them are not. Those are really kind of like the the reconnaissance and preparation phases where you're really not going to be able to detect if somebody is kind of like mining LinkedIn to see, what your employees, special technical specialties are. That's not something that realistically is going to be detectable from a soccer sim perspective. So of the 14, here are the 12 actual tactics at a high level. So based on those 6 tools, we can see that, initial access, we've got 44% or so. Privilege escalation does not look good at 2.9%, and so on and so forth. Next, though, we can really kind of dive into that. So underneath each of these tactics are all of the techniques and sub-techniques, that live under each of those tactics. And now we can get pretty granular. Due to the fact that we don't have, some specific visibility into data in specific data sources, you can see that under discovery, we're missing quite a few actual techniques and sub-techniques. However, lateral movement, we're pretty good. So this is another kind of illustrative slide that allows organizations to really kind of prioritize, what's our next move, what's our next investment, and so on. Metrics, just, at a very, very high level. And we also have the ability to kind of like slice and dice different types of metrics and whatnot. And that really gives us more of that, I would call it, almost that business executive layer kind of window into a lot of the technical, the technical stuff that's really underlying all of this. This is a pretty good window for leadership and management. Okay, so that's coverage. Now I want to talk about effectiveness. So realistically, what are we looking at? At TrustedSec, we've kind of defined a number of different variables. Here's some examples. I'll show a lot of them in a second, but here's just some examples, right? Deployment coverage. Is the tool deployed everywhere it should? Also, under deployment coverage is, of the features that should be enabled, in your environment, are all of them A, licensed, and B, enabled? Is the tool in, let's say, a monitor mode and it's not actually preventing any attacks? Is this tool only deployed in your server farm, where it also probably should be deployed at all of your endpoints? That all kind of like all these different variables really kind of, we look at from a coverage perspective. Alerting timeliness, when an alert triggers, how long does it take for the team that is ultimately responsible for responding to, let's say, events and incidents? How long does it take them to actually respond? Staff availability, right? Are there enough people looking at do we have enough eyes on the glass? Do we have enough people to actually respond to a lot of these different types of alerts? And then the last one is actually more of a SOC specific effectiveness variable called rule correlation maturity, right? So for each of the tools in your environment, how well does your monitoring team, how well can your monitoring team correlate different types of events? So log A from tool A, log B from tool B, and log C from tool C. If we see those in a small, relatively short period of time, that's actually an indicator of a specific attack, right? So how well does your team actually, handle rule correlation maturity? So those are just some of the examples. Here's a better view. You can see that we're also defining different, our protective effectiveness and detective effectiveness. So sometimes, it's not always the case, but sometimes there are different teams that are utilizing different aspects of different tools. And if that's the case, we have the ability to say, okay, well, here's kind of like the protective aspect of this particular tool. Here's a detective aspect of this particular tool. To be honest, most of the time, those effectiveness scores are the same. They're typically the same team, but we wanted to build into the tool at least that flexibility. So when we kind of like start looking into this, and working with an organization's teams to understand, okay, how have you ever do you have availability issues with this particular tool, right? does your firewall go down every once in a while, right? We need to look at availability, change control, right? Rule creation timeliness that I mentioned earlier, staff skill, right? Is this a new tool that nobody really has received any training on? Or, is your team absolute experts at that particular tool? All of these things then kind of boil up similarly to the coverage, right? But now we're looking at things from an effectiveness rating and effectiveness maturity perspective. So again, here's the window of the 12 tactics that can be detected with the techniques that can be detected. It's a much different view, right? Now we're looking at basically from a score of 1 through 5, 1 being poor and 5 being excellent. How effective are you at all of these different things from the previous slide per tool? And then when we begin combining all the effectiveness variables for each of the tools, we can, again, get into the actual, get into some of the more specific techniques and effectiveness ratings for each of the techniques and sub-techniques. So this ends up being very, very eye-opening for many, many organizations. So it's not just, again, we have these tools and therefore we should be able to detect all of these techniques. It's, well, we have these tools that should be able to detect all these techniques, but how effective are we at actually managing all of these tools? And that gives us much more of a real world maturity look at how effective you should be at detecting all of the different attack techniques documented in the framework. Some statistics and measurements. One of the things that we found really, really important and really, really valuable was, all right, well, what's your most comprehensive tools? What tools in your environment have visibility into the most data sources? If you have visibility, if a tool has visibility into the, a large number of data sources, and one data source should be able to detect a handful of techniques. Well, in this instance, for example, Windows Event Logs has visibility into 49 different data sources. That represents an awful lot of techniques that should be detected just via Windows Event Logs alone, right? So therefore, your team for Windows Event Logs should have really, really effective scores, because if you don't, you're likely going to be missing a lot of the detections that can come out of Windows Event Logs. Some of the other kind of stats and measurements here. Data sources not covered by tools. Here's the data sources in your environment that you're missing, right? We don't have any tools that have any visibility into these things. And now, again, we can kind of reverse it and extrapolate. Because you don't have visibility into these data sources and data component pairs, you're going to miss all these different types of attack techniques. So again, prioritization of things like that. And then data sources not applicable, right? So not everybody has, has let's say, pods and cloud instances and things of that nature. So it's good informational kind of data to have in a deliverable where it says, well, look, we don't really care about these because it's not applicable to our environment. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is adversary analysis. So utilizing a number of different threat intelligence sources, including the attack framework and the threat groups. Basically what we're trying to do is we want to define the groups that have targeted a specific industry, right? So from my perspective, it would be, targeting my client's industry. From many of your kind of perspectives, it's okay, well, who's targeting our industry, right? Whether it's finance, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's healthcare, right? But we want to kind of identify these groups and then effectively determine what are the most commonly seen attack techniques that these threat groups that are targeting our industry have been seen to use in the wild, right? Obviously, this gives us a lot of great intelligence to be used in threat modeling, but we want to ask the question, right? Who may be targeting us and how might they attack us? And by straining all of this intelligence from groups and techniques that they've been seen to use in the wild. That really gives us a pretty good step up just in terms of, like, again, prioritizing, right? We want to take a look at it from a probabilities perspective. And then at the end of the day, say, all right, well, we know that we have we know that we have groups that target our industry, and they use a lot of these specific attack techniques. So we need to make sure that we're very effective with our tools and the management of our tools in detecting and potentially preventing those more commonly seen attack techniques used in our industry. And so we can kind of basically do an overlay, right? So if, for example, the organization from an effectiveness perspective is really, really good at spear phishing, really good at detecting phishing and specifically spear phishing attachments, that then happens to be, let's say, one of the top 3 attack techniques by groups that target manufacturing, for example. So now we have the ability to say, all right, well, let's just kind of like take a look at the top 3 attack techniques for each of the tactics by, in use by all of the groups that are targeting our industry. And that, again, from just a prioritization and value perspective, this goes a long way to really kind of helping organizations look at effectiveness and making sure that at the very least, from a probabilities perspective, we're starting with the right ones, and we want to make sure that we are very effective at detecting and potentially preventing these very commonly seen attack techniques by groups that target our industry. Okay, so I do want to kind of like point out that there are a number of resources out here. Many obviously from MITRE and the ATT&CK Group, but also some other repos out there. The CTI GitHub repo, I believe they are working on the ATT&CK Workbench. But at the end of the day, right, the attack, all of the data in the ATT&CK framework is at this point living in this ATT&CK Sticks data, the Sticks database. And so that's something that anybody can just kind of download and start playing with. The ATT&CK CTI library, a Python library there. I initially started there with that particular library. I believe that was Roberto Rodriguez who authored or co-authored that. And I've been working with that for a while. If you're playing along, you will notice that, and if you've seen some of our previous attack path effectiveness webinars before, they were very, very much Excel based. We needed to get beyond that because at the end of the day, in trying to be as granular as possible with all of the different, like, okay, so I want to look at Linux protective effectiveness or Mac detective coverage and things of that nature. By trying to be so granular and effectively trying to do 3D math in 2 dimensions in Excel, I would say we effectively reached the functional limits of Excel, and with just millions and millions of formulas, and it was just out of control. So if you were kind of paying attention to some of the earlier slides, this is actually a new tool that we've developed internally at TrustedSec. And thankfully we've gotten away from Excel and have gotten into just a great web platform. I'm gonna shout out Charles Yost, who is our senior developer on this particular project. He's done a fantastic job. So thank you, Charles. And so this is all these resources though are out there, and anybody can really kind of start playing around and doing a lot of this work that we've already done. Or you can also just talk to us. But so I want to kind of close this out with a few slides around just what this really means, what are the benefits, and what's the value here, right? So the TrustedSec attack path effectiveness assessment, we're mapping your tools to MITRE, the ATT&CK framework, to determine what you can detect, right? Remember, that's the capabilities. Then we measure your capabilities, which then is effectiveness. We're looking at the most common attacks on your industry, and we're then comparing your effectiveness and overlaying those ratings with the most commonly seen attacks on your industry to help you prioritize investments and improvements. There's a lot of benefits to kind of looking at this organizational effectiveness aspect of a security program, kind of getting back to, we're looking at a security program, starting with program maturity, looking at organizational effectiveness, and also then looking at the likelihood and impact of things. So certainly baselining our detection capabilities, and then therefore feeding things like controls and threat readiness assessments. It also, this type of effectiveness assessment very much complements the other two, right? The program maturity and risk assessments in measuring an overall security program posture. It also really, really complements blue and purple team stuff. One of the things that, when you kind of take a look at even just standard penetration testing, but as you get into red, purple, and blue teaming, typically any one of those engagements are essentially looking at a handful of specific attack paths and testing those specific attack paths. On a pen test side, it's like, oh, okay, so here's some exploitable vulnerabilities that I found. Let's see if I can get in these ways. And similarly with purple and blue teams as well. But those are only a sample set of the entirety of the attack landscape, right? And so this kind of attack path effectiveness assessment really complements those more specific, looking at specific attack paths by saying, okay, well, also we can at least show how effective you are at potentially detecting all attack techniques that are out there, not just the ones that the purple and blue team, the blue teams are actually working with you to test and make sure that you have the right logs and things of that nature. So they really, really complement each other very, very well. Cyber insurance, obviously a hot button today. But one of the problems that I really have with the way the insurance industries have kind of like set up their questions about how secure you are. The example that I'm going to give, essentially there are more program maturity questions as opposed to how effective you are. Like, do you have a SIM? Not how effective is your SIM team at rule correlation maturity. That how effective your team is at rule correlation maturity, in my mind, is much more valuable than do you have a SIM, right? I think I would hope, that, in the future, cyber insurance, insurance providers and whatnot I really hope that they do start looking at more of this effectiveness versus just kind of the general questionnaire of like, do you do multi-factor authentication? I don't think there's a lot of value there. So speaking of value, right? These assessments are measuring how effective all the expensive tools are, that an organization has purchased, helps prioritize future security investments by looking at priorities, right? The most commonly seen attacks used against you and your industry and how effective you are at detecting that. And then measuring the detection of all known attack techniques, not just the ones that the purple and blue teams are actually helping you test, right? So definitely pair those up. And then the last thing I want to talk about here is specific threat actor telemetry also can be used as defensive validation, right? So we do a lot of ransomware resiliency assessments. And so part of that, we actually use a lot of this attack path telemetry to then derive the more commonly seen attack techniques that actually deliver ransomware. And so we can kind of look at it from that perspective. Last and not least, I mentioned this and kind of alluded to it. We are in the middle of a very kind of exciting, phase of a lot of our security program, development, in that we are now mapping through those attack mitigations, all of those kind of different levels, whether it's at more of a standard level or more of a procedure level or more of a an instruction or requirement level, but we're mapping that to our OPSEC performance maturity framework, which is what TrustedSec wants to see in a security program from a maturity perspective. And that, I think, is really going to have a lot of value once we kind of like, once it kind of gets to production, it's really going to, I think, going to have a lot of value being able to look at both of these frameworks, or let's just say, in this example, both of our frameworks, the attack framework and the OPSEC framework, or even looking at, attack and CSF, or attack and, and ISO, or attack and critical security controls, but being able to look at them almost in the same pane of glass, right? So being able to gauge both maturity and effectiveness together. And that's something that I'm really kind of excited about. So that's all I have for today. I will hand it back over to Stephen and see if we have any questions.
We do. Thanks so much, Rocky. All right, first one up. Are any of the standards, NIST, ISO, etc., mapped or mapping to attack directly yet, or is it too dynamic, or is that something you're doing the legwork on?
Yeah, so to date, I've seen some attempts at doing it, but in my mind, it's really, I think, now that the uses, so the mitigations for each technique that a mitigation, can mitigate, there are different uses. In my mind, it's really all of those now detailed uses that are going to facilitate mapping, mapping better into all of those different frameworks. And yeah, right now we are in the middle of that right now, at TrustedSec. My group, is the innovations group, and so we're spending a lot of time looking at all of those different uses and where do they live in terms of, like, a cybersecurity framework, or cybersecurity framework, or a critical security controls framework, or our OPSEC framework. So yeah, that's in my mind. I know that there has been some attempt to do it, but prior to the uses, I think that it was very difficult. Well, it definitely was very difficult. And now that we have a little bit more on that kind of like link into program maturity, I think it's going to be super, super valuable. Excellent. Thanks.
Another question, you said best case scenario, or I guess around detect and mitigation for prevent. There seems to be a lot of SOC burnout lately, trying to analyze and correlate information. Would this help with some of that?
So I think I'm not really sure that, like, it's a solution to SOC burnout. But I guess now that I'm thinking about it, maybe it is, because this, in my mind, really helps organizations, and especially SOC teams, kind of look at how effective they are at rule correlation maturity, right? And so that is a pillar kind of skill set within any SOC team. So really getting into the granular details of each tool, and do we have the expertise to in-house to really look at all the data that's coming out of these tools logs to be able to then correlate into indicators of compromise. I think that's certainly helpful. I don't know if it's a straightforward solution to SOC burnout, but I would certainly say that it will help, I think.
Okay, great. More of a comment than a question. Once you have that coverage heat map, you can marry that with a heat map of TTPs used by specific groups and malware. Org is malware that your organization is worried about, to see where your gaps are and prioritize threat hunting. So a little bit, how's it being used for threat hunting?
Yeah, well, that's exactly, the person who stated that, that's exactly right. I know MITRE's done a lot of work, just kind of saying, okay, well, what malware and attack techniques has APT3 used? Now let's kind of, run threat modeling and things like that against that particular either threat group or maybe to their point, specific malware. But yeah, it's certainly, there's so much you can do around, there's so much you can do through this process that really, really benefits threat hunting and threat modeling. And I really hope more people start kind of like keying into that, because I've always been a fan of Bruce Potter's threat model, which was now I'm gonna blank on it, aren't I? Asset actor performs action against asset for outcome because of motivation. There, I got So that's just my kind of one of like my favorite threat model formulas. And Bruce Prouder, I think that was at he presented that at one of the older DerbyCons, I think in 2014 or so. But yeah, I really see there's so much value in this kind of process, and it adds so much more to the threat modeling and threat hunting actions that are out there. I really hope more people see that.
Good memory. Way to bring that up. Are organizations able to correlate events from the cloud, network, and endpoints using this that you've seen, or are you doing anything with it?
Yeah, so one of the there are 11 platforms, right? So you've got Windows, you've got Mac, you've got Linux, you've got network. There are also a number of cloud platforms. So you're certainly going to see, and there certainly are, cloud-specific attack techniques. But there are also just a lot of general techniques that are applicable to both not cloud and cloud, right? A lot of the identity stuff is really, there's not a lot of difference. But at the end of the day, yeah, there's a lot of benefit. I think that, in my mind, that, obviously attacks and, different types of malware and things of that nature, it's an ongoing battle. It's that cat and mouse battle that's been, it hasn't changed since I got into this industry 30 years ago. I started disassembling an organization, disassembling virus code for one of the first antivirus companies that eventually got sold to Symantec, or Peter Norton Group at the time, but then became Symantec. But it hasn't changed. Like this cat and mouse kind of like, okay, adversary creates, either malware or an attack technique or something like that. And then the good guys have to figure out, what it's doing and how to prevent it, or how to, at least deflect it a little bit, et cetera. So I think as more and more organizations shift to cloud and more actors are focusing in on cloud, we're going to see a lot more probably cloud specific data sources and just, data source, data components, pairings, as time goes on. It's just, it's not going to change. It's always going to be that cat and mouse game.
What have you heard about updates to MITRE Defend?
I have not. So this is actually, funnily enough, on my list of things to reach out to, some of the people at MITRE that I'm familiar with, that I've had conversations with. Internally at TrustedSec, one of the potential kind of things that we're looking at is are there use cases, valuable use cases for the that defend framework? And I think certainly there are, but there's a question right now as to whether or not it's even being, I guess, updated, or is anybody actually working on it? So that's actually on one of my to-do lists. So I apologize. I don't have the specific answer to that one.
Gotcha. Another challenge seems to be getting MITRE ATT&CK into finished reports or presentations for executives. What suggestions do you have to assist with that?
Well, I mean, as TrustedSec, you can work with us, because we have our deliverable, our deliverables for the specific effectiveness, attack path effectiveness assessment. Like all of our deliverables, we have our high-level executive summary. I shared some of those more high-level metrics charts, earlier in the presentation. But yeah, there's a very, very fine line. When you look at metrics and where they have value, different metrics and measurements have different value at different layers of an organization. So one of the key things that we, throughout all of our advisory group and all of our advisory reports, we're very, very keenly aware that we need to make sure that at that executive layer, that we are providing the most valuable measurements and metrics at a very, very high level, so that, at the end of the day, we're helping organizations facilitate the technical teams effectively communicating to leadership so that leadership can make the right business decisions. And so, we're very, all of our advisory reports and even a lot of our technical reports are very, very keenly aware that we also need to be catering to that audience.
One more. Would it make sense to align this with a penetration test in some way?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can begin thinking about it from the perspective of, okay, let's say that we know that we're in the manufacturing industry and these groups target us and target manufacturing, and these groups have been known to use these attack techniques in the wild. Absolutely, then you can focus your penetration testing right there. Let's make sure that we're targeting our critical systems. We actually do this. This is actually, today part of our business risk assessment, where we are sitting with the kind of like business unit leadership to understand what's important, critical systems and things of that nature, and then doing that adversary analysis to determine what are the more commonly seen attack techniques, and then handing both telemetry from both of those two phases, what's important, and then how are groups that target our industry actually breaching other organizations in our industry, and handing that off to our technical TrustedSec penetration testing group. And then they go after those critical systems using those techniques. So yeah, 100%, you can absolutely use a ton of this telemetry to help really kind of, almost like sharpen your penetration testing.
Get more value from it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. I think that's it for the questions. I don't see any more coming up. So just wanted to thank you, Rocky, and an FYI for folks for our next webinar, we're going to be talking about the security lessons learned from the global conflict. So it's very, very interesting, unbelievable, really, what researchers thought would happen from this Russia-Ukraine conflict and how it's impacted the rest of the world, what it did, what they thought was going to happen, what didn't happen, how it affected ransomware, which there's big changes to that. So should be a really interesting one, led by our head of research, Carlos Perez. So definitely want to check that out and join that one. I believe it's December 7th. Okay, with that, once again, Rocky, thank you so much for your time, and thanks everyone for joining today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for taking the time out.